The morning was quiet and a little cold, and the sky was covered with soft grey clouds. People from different parts of the city were arriving at a large mansion where a very rich and powerful businessman had lived for many years. The news of his death had spread quickly, and many people wanted to attend his funeral. Some came because they respected him, some came because they had worked with him, and some came because they were curious about what would happen to his huge fortune. The garden. Outside the mansion was filled with expensive cars, well-dressed guests, and security guards who carefully watched everyone entering the property. Among the crowd stood the businessman's only son. He was young, confident, and known for his luxurious lifestyle. Many people believed he had never struggled in life because he had grown up surrounded by wealth and comfort. As he greeted important guests, he looked calm, but inside his mind he was already thinking about the future. He believed that after the funeral and the reading of the will, he would officially become the owner of everything his father had built. To him, it felt like the next chapter of power and success was about to begin. Not far from the entrance, a woman dressed in simple clothes slowly walked toward the garden. She was a widow who lived a quiet and modest life in a small neighborhood. Most people there did not recognize her, and some even looked at her with confusion because she did not look like the other guests. Her dress was plain, and she carried herself with a calm but slightly nervous expression. A few people whispered to each other, wondering why someone like her had come to such an important event. But the widow ignored the looks and quietly found a place to stand. She had come only to pay her respect to the man who had once helped her during a difficult time many years ago. The funeral ceremony was emotional but formal. A priest spoke about the businessman's life, his success, and the legacy he left behind. Some people listened carefully, while others were more interested in what would happen next. The son stood in front with a serious face, shaking hands and thanking people for coming. Even though the moment was sad, many guests knew that the real event everyone was waiting for would happen soon, the reading of the will. After the ceremony ended, the guests were invited inside the mansion. The house was large and beautifully decorated, with tall ceilings, shining floors, and expensive artwork on the walls. Everyone gathered in a large room where chairs had been arranged in rows. At the front of the room stood a table where the family attorney was preparing documents. He was an experienced man who had worked with the businessman for many years and was trusted to handle important matters. The room slowly became quiet as people waited for him to begin. The billionaire's son sat in the front row with confidence. He leaned back slightly in his chair, looking relaxed and even a little proud. In his mind, there was no doubt that he would inherit the majority of his father's wealth. Some of his friends and business partners sat nearby, smiling and whispering about the company's future under his leadership. The widow quietly took a seat in the back of the room. She did not expect to hear her name or receive anything. She had simply come because she felt it was the right thing to do. She remembered the past when the businessman had once shown her kindness during a very hard period in her life. That memory was enough for her. She was not thinking about money or inheritance. Finally, the attorney stood up and began reading the will. His voice was calm and clear as he explained how the businessman had decided to divide his assets. People listened carefully as names were mentioned and certain properties and responsibilities were described. As expected, the son received a large portion of the business empire, and he smiled proudly when he heard it. Many guests nodded, thinking everything was going exactly as predicted. But then something unexpected happened. The attorney paused for a moment and looked down at the document before continuing. He mentioned another name that most people in the room did not recognize at first. The widow looked up slowly when she realized it was her name being called. The room became quiet, and many guests turned their heads to see who she was. The attorney calmly stated that the widow had been left an inheritance of $10. For a few seconds, there was complete silence, and then the billionaire's son suddenly laughed. He could not believe what he had just heard. To him, the amount sounded like a joke. He turned to the people sitting near him and began making sarcastic comments, suggesting that the small amount meant the widow was not important at all. Some people laughed with him, while others looked uncomfortable. The widow felt the eyes of the entire room on her. Her face showed a mix of surprise and embarrassment. But she remained quiet. She did not argue or react angrily. Instead, she simply lowered her gaze and held her hands together, trying to stay calm. However, something about the attorney's expression was different. He did not laugh, and he did not seem surprised. In fact, he looked very serious as he continued holding the document. It seemed clear that the story was not finished yet. And although most people believed the moment was just a strange and meaningless part of the will, the attorney knew that something much bigger was about to begin, a secret connected to the past. and a decision that would soon change everything people thought. They understood about the inheritance, and about the quiet widow sitting in the back of the room. The laughter in the room slowly faded, but the tension it created stayed in the air. People began whispering to each other, some smiling, some confused, and others simply watching what would happen next. The billionaire's son still looked amused, leaning back in his chair with a proud expression. He felt that the moment had proven what he always believed, that money showed a person's true value in the world, and in his eyes the widow had just been shown to be unimportant. The widow, however, remained quiet in her seat at the back of the room. Her hands were gently folded together, and although the situation was embarrassing, she tried to keep her dignity. She had not come expecting anything, and the small amount mentioned in the will did not matter to her as much as the memory of the man who had once helped her. Still, the way people looked at her made the moment heavy and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the attorney carefully organized the documents on the table in front of him. His calm expression had not changed, and he did not react to the laughter or the whispers around the room. To him, the reading of the will was not finished yet, and he knew something that the others did not understand. The billionaire's son stood up and began talking loudly, almost as if he wanted everyone to hear him. He joked that maybe the widow should frame the $10 as a reminder of how close she once was to wealth. A few people laughed again, but others started to feel uneasy because his words sounded too harsh for such a moment. One of the older guests quietly shook his head, feeling that the young man's behavior showed a lack of respect. After all, the widow had come to pay her respects like everyone else, and mocking her openly did not seem right. But no one said anything directly, because the son was now the most powerful person connected to the late businessman's empire. The widow slowly stood up, thinking that the event was over and that she should leave before the situation became even more uncomfortable. She did not want attention or sympathy. She only wanted to return to her quiet life. But just as she started to walk toward the exit, the attorney suddenly spoke. "Excuse me," he said in a polite but firm voice. The room became quiet again, and everyone looked toward the front. The widow paused and turned back slowly, surprised that the attorney was speaking directly to her. "If you don't mind," the attorney continued, "could you please stay for a few more minutes?" This simple request confused many people in the room, including the billionaire's son. He frowned slightly, wondering why the attorney was asking the widow to remain. In his mind, there was nothing more to discuss. The widow hesitated for a moment, unsure what to do. She was not used to being the center of attention in a room full of wealthy and important people. But the attorney's voice sounded respectful, so she nodded gently and stayed where she was. Whispers quickly spread across the room again. People began guessing what could be happening. Some thought there might have been a mistake in the document, while others believed there could be another small detail related to the inheritance. The billionaire's son crossed his arms and looked slightly irritated now. He had expected the meeting to end quickly so he could continue discussing business matters with his partners. Instead, the attention was now shifting toward the widow, and he did not like it. He spoke again, this time with a curious but slightly mocking tone, asking the attorney if there was something else the widow needed to hear about her great fortune. A few people gave uncomfortable smiles, but the attorney did not react to the sarcasm. Instead, the attorney calmly walked a few steps forward and looked toward the widow. His expression was serious but respectful, and it became clear that whatever he was about to say was important. "There are a few additional matters connected to the will," he explained, "and they require a private discussion." The room immediately filled with curiosity. The guests exchanged looks, and even the billionaire's son leaned forward slightly, now paying closer attention. The widow looked surprised again, because she had no idea what the attorney was referring to. In her mind, she had already accepted the small and unusual inheritance mentioned earlier. She had not expected anything more. But something about the attorney's calm confidence made the moment feel different, almost mysterious, as if a hidden part of the story had not yet been revealed. Outside the large windows of the mansion, the wind moved softly through the trees, and the sunlight began to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the room. It was a quiet moment, yet it felt like the beginning of something important. The billionaire's son watched closely as the attorney approached the widow, and for the first time since the will reading had started, his confident smile slowly faded, replaced by curiosity and a small sense of unease, because deep inside he could feel that the story was not as simple as he had believed, and that whatever was about to happen next might change the way everyone in the room saw the widow, and possibly even change the future he had already imagined for himself. The room slowly returned to its quiet whispers as the attorney gently asked the widow to follow him. Most of the guests were confused, and some leaned forward in their chairs, trying to understand what was happening. The billionaire's son watched carefully, his curiosity growing stronger with every passing second. He did not like surprises, especially on a day when he expected everything to go exactly as he planned. The widow walked slowly toward the front of the room, feeling the eyes of everyone watching her. Her steps were careful and a little nervous. She had never imagined that she would be called forward like this in a place filled with powerful and wealthy people. Still, she trusted the attorney's calm voice and respectful behavior, so she followed him without asking too many questions. The attorney then led her into a smaller office next to the main hall, closing the door behind them. The sudden quiet inside the room felt different from the noisy whispers outside. Sunlight entered through a large window, lighting up a wooden desk covered with files and old-looking documents. The widow stood there quietly, unsure of what she was about to hear. For a moment, the attorney did not speak. Instead, he carefully opened a drawer and took out another envelope. It looked older than the documents he had been reading earlier, almost as if it had been kept safely for many years. The widow watched with curiosity and a little confusion, wondering why something like this involved her. Finally, the attorney looked at her and spoke in a calm and respectful tone. He explained that what happened in the main hall was only the first step of the inheritance process. The $10 mentioned in the will had a meaning that most people in the room did not understand. It was not meant to insult her or make her look unimportant. In fact, it was a symbol connected to something from the past. The widow looked surprised. Her mind started searching through old memories, trying to understand what he meant. She had known the businessman many years ago, long before he became one of the richest men in the region. Back then, life had been very different for both of them. The attorney continued explaining, telling her that many years earlier, when the businessman was struggling and trying to build his future, there had been a moment when he almost gave up. At that time, very few people believed in him, and most people ignored him. But during that difficult period, someone had helped him in a simple but meaningful way. That person, the attorney revealed, was the widow standing in front of him. The widow's eyes widened slightly as the memory slowly returned to her mind. She remembered a young man who once came to her small shop asking for help when he had very little money and nowhere to go. She had given him food and a place to rest without expecting anything in return. To her, it had only been a small act of kindness, something anyone could have done. But to the businessman, that moment had meant much more. The attorney explained that the man had never forgotten her kindness. Even after he became successful and powerful, he often spoke about the people who helped him when he had nothing. However, he also believed that true gratitude should be shown at the right time, in a way that carried meaning. The $10 mentioned in the will represented the exact amount he had borrowed from her on that day many years ago. It was his way of reminding the world of where he had started, and of the kindness that helped him continue his journey. The widow listened quietly, her heart filled with emotion as she realized that the past had not been forgotten. She had lived her life without expecting recognition or reward, so hearing this story made her both surprised and deeply touched. But the attorney was not finished yet. He carefully placed the old envelope on the desk and explained that there was another part of the inheritance that had to be completed in person. Something that could not be announced in front of the entire room. Something that required her presence and her agreement. The widow felt a mix of curiosity and nervousness. She had no idea what the attorney was about to reveal next, but she could sense that whatever it was important. Meanwhile, outside the office, the billionaire's son could not stop thinking about what was happening behind the closed door. His curiosity slowly turned into suspicion. He started wondering if his father had left something hidden that no one knew about, something that might affect the future of the family fortune. Inside the quiet office, the attorney finally spoke again, telling the widow that they needed to travel somewhere together to complete the final part of the inheritance, a place connected to the businessman's past and the promise he had made long ago. The widow looked at him in surprise, realizing that the story she thought had ended with a simple $10 inheritance was actually just beginning, and that somewhere beyond the mansion walls, a secret was waiting to be revealed, a secret that would soon shock everyone who had laughed at her only moments earlier, especially the billionaire's son who believed he already understood everything about wealth, power, and inheritance. When the door of the small office finally opened, the quiet whispers in the main hall suddenly grew louder. Everyone turned their heads at the same time. Curious to see what had happened inside, the widow stepped out slowly, and the attorney followed her with a calm and serious expression. There was something different in the atmosphere now, almost as if an invisible tension had filled the room. The billionaire's son watched closely from his seat, trying to read the situation. He noticed that the widow looked surprised but not upset, and the attorney seemed confident, as if he had just explained something important. This made the son even more curious, because he could not imagine what kind of secret could involve someone he had just mocked a few minutes earlier. The attorney spoke briefly to the guests, explaining that the reading of the will was complete for now and that there were some final legal matters that needed to be handled privately. Most people accepted the explanation and slowly began to stand up. Some started leaving the mansion, while others gathered in small groups discussing what they had just witnessed. However, the billionaire's son did not move. His instincts told him that something unusual was happening, and he did not like the feeling of not knowing. When he saw the attorney guiding the widow toward the exit of the mansion, his curiosity turned into determination. He quietly decided that he would follow them and find out the truth himself. Outside, the air felt cooler and calmer compared to the tense atmosphere inside the mansion. The attorney and the widow walked toward a dark car waiting near the gate. The driver opened the door respectfully, and the widow hesitated for a moment before getting inside. She was still trying to understand everything that had happened so quickly. Just a short time ago, she had been sitting quietly at the back of a room full of strangers, and now she was being taken somewhere she had never heard of before. The attorney reassured her with a calm voice, telling her that everything would soon make sense. His tone was respectful and patient, which helped the widow feel a little more comfortable. Even though she did not know where they were going, she trusted that the late businessman must have had a good reason for this final request. As the car slowly drove away from the mansion, the widow looked out of the window, watching the large gates close behind them. She could not stop thinking about the past and the memories that had suddenly returned to her mind. She had never imagined that a small act of kindness from many years ago could still matter so much to someone powerful and successful. Meanwhile, not far behind them, another car quietly left the mansion grounds. Inside it was the billionaire's son, who had decided to follow at a distance. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, making sure he did not lose sight of the attorney's vehicle. His mind was filled with questions, and a small part of him felt uneasy, as if something important was slipping out of his control. The journey took them away from the busy city streets and into quieter roads surrounded by open land and tall trees. The buildings became fewer, and the environment looked older and more peaceful. The widow noticed the change in scenery and wondered where they were going. She had lived in the same area for many years but had never traveled this far outside the city. The car continued moving for a long time until they finally reached a narrow road that led toward a large piece of land hidden behind tall iron gates. The gates looked old but strong, and vines had grown along the metal bars, giving the place a mysterious and forgotten appearance. The driver slowly stopped the car in front of the entrance, and the widow looked around with surprise. She could see trees, open fields, and the roof of a large building far in the distance. It looked like a property that had been carefully protected and kept away from public attention for many years. The attorney stepped out of the car first and walked toward the gate. He took out a small key from his pocket and unlocked a metal box attached to the side of the entrance. Inside it was a control switch. After pressing it, the heavy gates slowly began to open with a deep mechanical sound that echoed through the quiet surroundings. At that moment, the billionaire's son arrived nearby and parked his car a short distance away, hiding behind a line of trees so he would not be noticed. His eyes widened as he watched the gates opening, because he had never seen this property before in his life. Even though his father owned many lands and buildings, this place was completely unfamiliar to him. The widow stepped out of the car and looked ahead as the gates fully opened, revealing a long road leading toward a beautiful estate hidden deep inside the property. The sunlight touched the tall building in the distance, making it look almost unreal, like something from a forgotten story waiting to be discovered again. In that moment, the widow realized that the small $10 inheritance had only been the beginning of something much bigger, something that had been hidden for years, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And behind the trees, watching everything in shock and disbelief, the billionaire's son slowly began to understand that the story he had laughed at earlier was about to change in a way he never expected, and that whatever waited beyond those gates might be far more valuable than anything he had imagined, or believed belonged to someone like the quiet widow he had mocked. The gates slowly opened wider, and the quiet sound of metal moving echoed across the empty land. The widow stood still for a moment, looking down the long road that stretched ahead of her. Tall trees lined both sides of the path, their branches moving gently in the wind. At the end of the road, the large estate became clearer, and it was far more impressive than she had first imagined. The attorney walked beside her and gestured forward, calmly inviting her to continue. The driver moved the car slowly through the gates, and the widow followed, still trying to understand what she was seeing. Every step forward made the property look more beautiful and mysterious at the same time. The grass was well maintained, the trees were old and strong, and the main building stood proudly in the distance like it had been waiting for someone to arrive. Hidden behind the trees not far away, the billionaire's son watched everything with disbelief. He had followed them carefully, and now he could not take his eyes off the estate in front of him. His father had never mentioned this place to him before, and that thought alone made him feel uncomfortable. He had always believed he knew every detail about his father's wealth and properties, but clearly there were secrets he had never been told. As the widow and the attorney reached the front of the estate, the car stopped near a wide stone entrance. The building was large and elegant, with tall windows and strong wooden doors that looked both old and valuable. Even though the estate had been hidden from the public, it was clear that someone had taken care of it over the years. It did not look abandoned at all. Instead, it looked preserved, almost like it had been protected for a special purpose. The widow looked around slowly, her eyes filled with wonder and confusion. She had lived a simple life for so long that standing in front of such a place felt unreal. She quietly asked the attorney why they had come here, and what this estate had to do with her. The attorney smiled gently, as if he had been waiting for that question. He explained that the property they were standing on had a long history connected to the businessman who had recently passed away, many years earlier, when he was just beginning his journey and had very little money. This land had played an important role in his first success. It was one of the earliest investments he made after starting his career. However, as his business grew bigger and spread across cities, he decided to keep this estate private. It was not part of his public companies or well-known assets. Instead, it became a place he quietly protected over the years, waiting for the right time and the right person to give it to. The widow listened carefully, still struggling to believe what she was hearing. She never imagined that she would be connected to something like this. In her mind, she was just a person who had once helped a stranger in a small way, nothing more. Meanwhile, the billionaire's son slowly moved closer from behind the trees, trying to hear what the attorney was saying. The more he watched, the more nervous he felt, because deep inside he began to realize that this situation might not be as simple as he thought earlier. The attorney then took out a folder filled with documents and showed them to the widow. He explained that the estate, including the land, the buildings, and everything connected to it, had been legally transferred to her name according to the instructions left in the will. For a moment, the widow could not speak. Her mind went completely silent, and she looked again at the estate in front of her, trying to understand that it now belonged to her. The idea felt impossible, almost like a dream she had never expected to experience in her lifetime. At that exact moment, the billionaire's son stepped out from behind the trees, unable to hide his presence any longer. His face showed shock, frustration, and disbelief all at once. He walked closer, staring at the attorney and then at the widow, as if trying to confirm what he had just heard. The attorney noticed him immediately but did not seem surprised. Instead, he calmly repeated the truth, explaining that the businessman had chosen the widow as the rightful owner of this hidden estate because of her kindness and honesty from many years ago. The billionaire's son felt his confidence slowly disappear. Just a short time earlier, he had laughed at the idea of the widow receiving $10. But now he was standing in front of a property far more valuable than he had expected, something his father had never even mentioned to him. The widow, however, did not react with pride or anger. She simply looked around the estate again, taking a deep breath as she realized how much her life had suddenly changed. And in that quiet moment, as the wind moved gently through the trees and the large estate stood silently behind her, the billionaire's son began to understand that the story he had mocked was actually a lesson he was only starting to learn, a lesson about respect, gratitude, and the unexpected ways life sometimes rewards the people who never ask for anything in return. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The open land around the estate was quiet, and the only sound was the wind moving softly through the tall trees. The billionaire's son stood there trying to process what he had just heard. His confident smile from earlier that day was completely gone, replaced by disbelief and a strange feeling he had never experienced before. Just a few hours earlier, he had been laughing inside the mansion, making jokes about the widow and her $10 inheritance. He had believed that money always stayed in the hands of people like him, powerful, successful, and born into wealth. But now he was standing in front of a hidden estate that legally belonged to the very woman he had mocked in front of everyone. The widow remained calm, even though the situation was overwhelming. She slowly walked a few steps across the stone path leading toward the main building, looking carefully at the place that had suddenly become part of her life. Her expression was not proud or excited in the way most people might expect. Instead, it showed quiet surprise and deep thought, as if she was still trying to understand why fate had brought her to this moment. The attorney stood nearby, watching both of them. He had handled many important legal matters during his career, but this moment felt special even to him, because he knew how long the businessman had planned this decision. The estate was not just a property. It was a message left behind, a message about gratitude and about remembering the people who helped you when no one else did. The billionaire's son finally spoke, his voice no longer filled with arrogance like before. Instead, it sounded uncertain and slightly shaken. He asked the attorney why his father had never told him about this place, why such an important property had been kept hidden for so many years. The attorney answered honestly, explaining that the businessman believed some things in life were more important than wealth or business success. This estate was connected to a promise he had made long ago, and he wanted to keep that promise in a meaningful way after his passing. It was never meant to be part of competition or family power. It was meant to show gratitude. Hearing this explanation made the son quiet again, because deep inside he began to realize something uncomfortable about himself. He had spent most of his life thinking about money, status, and control, but he had rarely thought about the small moments that truly mattered to people. The widow then turned toward him. Her eyes showed kindness rather than anger. Even though he had laughed at her earlier, she did not look at him with resentment. Instead, she spoke gently, saying that she never expected any of this and that she had only helped his father many years ago because it felt like the right thing to do at the time. Those simple words made the moment even more powerful, because the son could clearly see that she was telling the truth. She had not been waiting for a reward or recognition. She had simply lived her life with honesty and kindness, something he had rarely considered important before. As time passed, the reality of the situation slowly settled in. The estate was now officially hers, and the decision could not be changed. The billionaire's son understood that his father had made this choice carefully and intentionally. Even though it surprised him, he knew there was nothing he could do about it. But more than losing control over a hidden property, something else was happening inside him. He was beginning to feel regret for laughing, for judging someone based on appearance, and for believing that money made him better than others. Finally, he looked at the widow and apologized. His voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard before. He admitted that he had acted disrespectfully and that he had not understood the full story earlier. The apology was not dramatic or loud, but it was honest, and everyone present could feel the sincerity in his words. The widow accepted the apology with a simple nod, showing that she was not interested in holding on to anger. She had already lived a life full of challenges, and she knew that kindness often created stronger changes than bitterness. In the weeks that followed, the story of the hidden estate spread through the city. People talked about how the businessman had rewarded someone who once helped him during his hardest days. The story became more than just news. It became a lesson that many people remembered. The widow decided to take care of the estate and use it wisely. She made plans to restore parts of the land and help people in need, honoring the memory of the man who had trusted her with such a responsibility. As for the billionaire's son, that day stayed in his mind longer than he expected. It changed the way he looked at people and the way he understood success, because sometimes the most valuable inheritance is not money or property, but the lesson that teaches a person who they truly are, and the moment when they realize that respect, humility, and kindness are worth far more than any fortune hidden behind iron gates. And that lesson became something he would never forget for the rest of his life.